Hello, hello, everyone. I am Kimberly Griffin, the publisher of the Mississippi Free Press. I'm here with editor Asia Wiggins. We're so excited to have our guest here, uh, Dr. Deandra Orey, who is a political science professor at Jackson State University. Before we came on, and he also is a undergraduate graduate of Mississippi Valley State. So we have determined that he is swag for the week. He is swag, right? We're going to talk about a lot of stuff. He's been emailing me all day. That's what smart people do. They start thinking and they're like, let's talk about this. Let's talk about this. So, so we are going to, I always like to tell folks we're going to jump right in. And I like for people to tell us about who they are, how they got here, because I believe people believe what they can see. We are two Callaway Chargers. I am reveling in that this week because we are now a B school, and I am at the level of petty. The level of petty that is happening across my social media about this is amazing. Um, Dr. Orey, tell us about where you grew up. How you ended up becoming a political science professor. What that path was like for you.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you all for having me. I am originally from Jackson, Mississippi. Grew up in Bel Air subdivision. Went to McLeod Elementary School. Was one of the first groups of students who were integrated into the public school system. So we integrated McLeod Public School right around 1972-ish. I was talking to someone the other day, and we were talking about. Yeah. So first of all, thank you all lies that may have been told. We were talking about the book lies my teacher told me. And one of the lies I remember is going over to the Civil War Museum and the battlefield and coming away with one of those little truncated hats on. We can talk about that a little later. But I went on to Brinkley Middle School, and integration took place right around 1971, 72, 73-ish. By the time I got to Callaway, integration had ended. Callaway, which was about 15, 20% Black right around the 1970s, was now 95% Black. And so I left Brinkley, went to Callaway. I left Callaway, went to Mississippi Valley State, played football at Valley from 1984 to 1988. Played with a guy that was pretty good, a guy by the name of Jerry Rice. And then I left Mississippi Valley State and went to the University of Mississippi. But before that, I sold cars. So if you ever need any advice on buying a car, just get with me. So I went to the University of Mississippi and got a public administration master's degree. And I left there and went to the University of New York, where I got a master's in political science. And then I came back down south, went to the University of New Orleans, got a PhD in political science, taught at the University of Mississippi for 2 years. And I left the University of Mississippi because of that old flag. So in 2001, we had the flag vote, and I was teaching at the University of Mississippi. I was a young guy, gung-ho about taking the flag down. And when it failed, it was actually defeated 65% to 35%. It really was like a kick in the gut. I really thought it would change. So I moved to Nebraska, of all places. So I moved to Nebraska, taught at the University of Nebraska, stayed there for 8 years, and got an opportunity to come back home to Jackson State, and I took that opportunity. And so here I am. I am swag.
So you're, guy from Mississippi, and you, at what point do you say, this is what I want to focus on? This is what I want my area of expert. This is what I want my legacy to be. Because you do focus on voting rights. How do you get to that place?
So many folks, in terms of, how you obtain knowledge is the socialization process, right? And so I was born in Clarksdale, Mississippi, but we just happened to be in Clarksdale that night. But my mother is actually from Clarksdale, and we would drive Highway 49 to Clarksdale. And I asked her, I said, why do those people have all that land, but they have these little small houses? And she turned to me and she said, "Baby, that's not their land." And so, of course, they were sharecroppers. And so that stuck with me. And over the years, I didn't realize that, I was being socialized with each of those transactions in the Delta, going to an integrated school, then it becoming segregated. And all of these issues began to accumulate. And, those were the issues that I began to focus on. My father worked with the AFL-CIO as a union organizer. And so they dealt with politics. They endorsed candidates and whatnot. So I was around politics, but my undergrad degree was actually in business administration and accounting. And then when I went to the University of Mississippi, I got a master's in public administration, and that was in the political science department.
One of the things we talked about before this broadcast is we talked a little bit, this is not your area of expertise in redlining, but it's one of the things I think we need to discuss a little more. I think our Gen X, Gen whatever's coming behind, and not Gen Y, Gen Z, I think they're understanding that a little more because of some of the lawsuits that are happening about mortgages and banking and mortgage denial based on redlining. But one of the things you talked to me about, emailed me about today, was how redlining affected Black farm laws. Talk to us a little bit about what is redlining, what does that look like, and how it's particularly how it's affected Mississippi farmers.
Yeah, so I'll talk about that. Not quite redlining, but it's in that same context. So redlining, the textbook definition would be discrimination or discriminatory practices, rather, of denying loans to high risk borrowers. So this is, I guess, the classic ecological fallacy where, you take groups behavior and then extract individual decisions. So you have a group that fits all of these risk characteristics, but then when the individual comes into the office, you make a decision based on that individual. And so redlining actually was literally taking a red marker and getting a map of those areas that were at risk areas and drawing a red line around those areas, those neighborhoods. And so then you actually had these areas where they would consider them to be, as you see here, hazardous areas. And that meant that those were areas that they did not make many loans in those areas. And now when I was referring to farming, so with Black farmers were denied loans. And this is comparable to being denied loans through redlining. It's not redlining, but it's comparable. So Black farmers were denied loans. In the 1920s, Black farmers were 1 out of 7 farmers were Black in the 1920s. And then 1 out of every 4 farmer owned their land. So between 1920 and 1997 and up to today, Black farmers lost 98% of the land that they once owned. And so there was a lawsuit, Pickford versus Glickman. And in that lawsuit, it was found that the federal government did discriminate against Black farmers. And at the time, it was held as the biggest civil rights lawsuit in terms of a settlement. It was roughly, they were looking at about $2.25 billion. At the end of the lawsuit, after they settled everything and the lawyers got their money, the typical farmer walked away with about $50,000. So it didn't reach the height of 2.25 billion, let alone 600 million. And so this was a case where reparations, if we want to, think of a case of reparations, it was in a sense reparations, but it did not. They did not receive the amount of money that was promised initially.
So of the things we talk about is one of the things we're talking about right now, and we're especially with the midterm elections happening soon, um, are redistricting and voting rights. And this is one of your areas of focus. Um, I'm gonna let you take it where you want, but first I want to talk about the landscape right now. What are we seeing? What's happening across the country, but and how what we're seeing and what's happening in Mississippi that we should be paying attention to, or participating in.
So let me just can I just go back a little bit in terms of history? Let's go back.
Absolutely.
So I like to use this exercise because it kind of puts things in the context. So you go back to 1619 when Black folks were enslaved and brought here to America. You go from 1619 to 1868, 1870, when the 15th Amendment was passed, that allowed Black men to vote, some Black men to vote. You're talking about a period where Blacks could not participate in the political process, roughly 250 years. And then you take the small period of Reconstruction from, say, 1870 to 1876, where Blacks were able to participate in the political process, and Mississippi elected the first 2 Black senators in the United States. And Black people actually were in legislative positions as well as other elected positions. And that lasted only 6 years. And then we had Jim Crow from 1890 to 1965. Blacks could not participate in the political process again. So at that point, we're looking at 6 years that Blacks were able to participate in the political process compared to 334 or some odd years that Blacks could not participate in the political process. And then you take 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed, and you bring that up to speed to now, you're looking at about 87% of the time that Black people have been in this country, they have not been able to participate in the political process. Now, when you think about Mississippi, or when you think about voter suppression, you got to think about a place like Mississippi. In 1890, right after Reconstruction, Mississippi led the charge in disenfranchising Black people. So Mississippi was one of the first states, or the first state rather, to revise its constitution, and one of the primary reasons was to eliminate Blacks from the voting roll. And one of those strategies that was written into law was felon disenfranchisement. And so some people ask the question, why isn't Mississippi leading the charge now with respect to voter suppression, given its conservative, nature of the state? And Mississippi doesn't have to, because those laws are already on the book. So Mississippi had adopted many of those laws going back to 1890, but then coming up to, laws such as voter ID. Those laws are already on the book. And so other states are just now adopting some of these suppressive laws, but Mississippi had actually had those laws on the book before. Now, some people may say, well, look, Mississippi has the largest number of Black elected officials. That is true. And that is true because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There was an extension to the Voting Rights Act in 1982. And the way the courts read that extension was, you need to, when you hold redistricting, you should draw as many Black districts as you can possibly draw. This was after one of the lawsuits. Well, Mississippi adhered, and Mississippi drew many Black majority districts. And this is why you have the large number of Black legislators in the legislature now. What happened, though, is that as you increase the number of Black legislators, there was a decline in some of those white progressives, because some of those districts are hyper majority. So you may have 65% Black district, and maybe it could have been 60% Black. And if you needed, if you wanted to create what they call an influence district, meaning that you had enough Blacks, but they weren't the majority, so you have 20% Blacks and you pair that 20% with 40% progressive whites, then you get a majority of blacks and progressives, and then you get a progressive legislator who's a white legislator. Currently, the districts are so segregated, if you will, that you get black legislators, you get white legislators, you get black Democrats, and you get white Republicans. And so that's how we got here as it relates to us being leading the nation in the number of black elected officials. But the main point I wanted to make is this was not because of coalescing or coalition building between blacks and whites. Blacks have only won in areas where they are the majority. There aren't any cases where blacks were the minority in a district and the black candidate won. I.e., if you look at statewide elections, you haven't seen any blacks elected to statewide elections since Reconstruction. And so that suggests that it's not that, you're getting white crossover voting to assist blacks in winning elections. You're getting majority black districts, and that's what has led to blacks being elected to political office.
So talk about national offices, because we have been able to build some coalitions. And why does that happen?
Well, if you take a place like Mississippi now, so if we're talking about Mississippi has not elected a Democrat to a Senate position in quite a while now. So when we look at statewide races, such as the governor's race, we look at, the Secretary of State, so on and so forth, blacks overwhelmingly vote Democrat 90-some-odd% of the time in Mississippi. And so they are unable to elect the candidate of their choice, even at the national level. Even if you look at, we're talking about Mississippi now, if you look at Democrats winning the presidency, the state of Mississippi has not supported a Democratic candidate in the last X number of years. So the Democrats have not performed well at all at the state level, and that's the same with respect to blacks.
That's it. Very interesting. So I have two questions, and you kind of, I'm looking at your comments. You kind of gave us a history lesson, because I wanted to go back to the first thing you said about when you asked your mom about those small houses. And you kind of gave us a good history of getting to that point. But tell me what is that? Why is that? Like, can you give us a picture of them having these small shacks on this land that they don't own? How does that come about?
Yeah, so slavery ends in 1865. Blacks have nowhere to go. So they roam around, but then they look up, there's nowhere to go. They have to return to what was the former master's land. And they were, supposed to be paid X number of dollars for their work. But then the owner of the land began to provide them credit. And they would get so indebted that they weren't able to leave the land. And so they were relegated to sharecropping, where they would borrow, money during the off season of farming, and they actually were unable to leave the land.
I just want to, if I can say something, Kimberly. Okay, my next question is about voter suppression. And you talked about how Mississippi led the charge back in 1890. We've already had those laws. So kind of give us examples of real life laws today, because I don't think people understand. I think if they hear you say the laws that these states are making today that resemble suppression of voting. So just give us some examples of some of those laws that are today, and not 1890, but in 2022.
Yeah. So if you think about like voter ID, and students when I'm teaching, I ask students whether or not we should have voter ID, and they say, well, of course, everyone should have an ID. But the statistics have shown that people of color and poor people are more likely, or less likely rather, to have formal IDs. And, I'll give you an anecdotal case where the Metro Center here in Jackson used to have a DMV office where they gave out driver's license. Well, that office moved. Well, this is where you get your formal ID. This is where you get your ID or your driver's license. So now people who would normally have gone to the Metro Center because that's where they live, they now have to go, say, to Woodrow Wilson or Pearl. And, it's not as if people are beating the door down to register to vote. And in a democracy, to be ruled by the people, the process should be open, and it should be an easy enough process that there are no barriers that prevent individuals from participating in the political process. And so voter ID is one of those issues that, the average person would say, well, no, everyone should have an ID. But, in this particular case, I think this is a classic case where, folks wouldn't be able to get, it makes an assumption that people, one, are mobile. And that's just simply not the case. And so it becomes a class issue as well.
Yeah, and one of the things you'll see is, for example, Utah has very expansive voting time. You can mail in the vote. You can do all this stuff because they have a homogeneous population.
Right.
I would counter that it would not be as, when I looked, I was like, gosh, Utah is really living the dream. Like, you can vote all these different ways. And Australia, it's you have to go vote. Like, it's like barbecues outside of the precinct. But again, basically a homogeneous population. Right. So it's this idea that now I'm giving Dr. Orey more work, but when you have time, studying these places across internationally, but also across the United States, the more inclusive, the more diverse your population is, the more restricted your voting laws become.
Yes.
Because there's somebody trying to control something. If I know that my population is white and they're probably going to vote all the same way, I don't care if they mail in that ballot. I don't care if they have an ID. It's all going my way.
Yeah, so you're talking like internationally compulsory voting. Those were like states that, the countries that had compulsory voting. Right. But you hit on the point, in as it relates to Mississippi and how Mississippi leads the charge. I once, was talking to somebody casually, and I said, I should write a book on how Mississippi birthed America. But of course, that's not the case because America birthed Mississippi. But my point is, Mississippi has a high percentage of blacks relative to whites in this state. So Mississippi has 40%, state has 40% black. There was a book written in 1949 by a guy by the name of V.O. Key, Southern Politics and State and Nation. And in that book, he said that in those areas where there are high densities of blacks, where the concentration is 30, 40, 50, 60% black, this is where you will find the most hostility and the largest support for demagogues. So this is in the 1930s, 1940s. You got people like Bilbo, just spreading the, N-word, and that was basically his campaign. Well, if you look at it now, and the campaigns that are being run and the language that's being used, the Southern strategy was born out of, the South. That's the Southern strategy. And so the Southern strategy was when Goldwater ran in 1964, he said, we need to go hunting where the ducks are, meaning that he needed to go and find those white voters, and they were in the South. Goldwater would oppose civil rights, and that was enough of an issue in 1964 when he opposed the Civil Rights Act for the southern states to support him. So in the South, these are areas that are high density in blacks. Well, if you look fast forward to the nation as a whole, the tension that we have now as it relates to race is about the browning and darkening of America. And so this has become Mississippi politics, if you will. If you study Mississippi politics, you can understand the current landscape in America today. It's because of the high percentages or perceived percentages of black and brown people that goes. It's consistent with Vioki's racial threat hypothesis.
Sorry, I was on mute. I'm learning a whole lot. You just got my brain just like trying to process all the history and where we are right now. I know Kimberly mentioned earlier about, our current redistricting, right, Rikia? And Mississippi we currently have new redistricting zones now. So can you talk a little bit more about how that affects voter suppression and also the racial tension that you're talking about in Mississippi?
Wait, say that again. I missed that first part.
Can you talk about how the current, we just recently had a new redistricting here in Mississippi. So can you talk a little bit more about how that relates to voter suppression and the racial tension you're talking about this in Mississippi now?
Yeah, so if we take like the state legislature, for the most part, those lines do stay intact. I know that there was one legislator, they were redrawing her lines and was almost about to draw her out of her district. I don't think that ended up happening. But in the state legislature, because of the polarization that exists, in other words, because all the Democrats are black and the Republicans are white, save for a few Democrats that are white, because blacks are so far in the minority, there's a supermajority in the House and in the Senate. They don't really have to gerrymander districts that will, discriminate against blacks in this case, because blacks are in a minority. And so the districts have already been drawn to where blacks have the maximum number of majority black districts possibly that they can get with the current average of districts. So average district that I saw a few years ago was about 69%. Now, some may make that argument that, we should decrease that number to 60, 65, 60, 60%. And that should increase the opportunity to create more influence districts where blacks wouldn't necessarily be in the majority, but they would be in the minority and be able to coalesce with progressive whites. Whether or not the possibility for that exists, we don't know, but that is one potential. So, but to my point, redistricting really is not an issue at current, at least in the state legislature. There was an issue, I think, with Congressman Thompson's district, where they drew it from one end of the state almost down to the other end of the state. And I think originally it was supposed to be all of Jackson, and it ended up not being all of Jackson. And, there were different reasons that I've heard about that some whites didn't want to be in that district. I'm not sure, whether or not that's fact or not, but all of Jackson is not in his district. And that could have some racial implications.
That's interesting. So changing subjects a little bit, I'm going to ask you to talk about one of my favorite studies that you've done that is you and your wife, Erin Shirley Orey, did a study that you presented to a group I was invited to a couple years ago on natural hair and bias. We actually had an MFP member event with Alelia Bundles, who is Madam C.J. Walker's great granddaughter, and she kind of dispelled some myths about the hair straightening and the was and the wasn't of what actually happened during that time. So that's my plug to become an MFP VIP club member if you want to see that conversation. But tell me what you learned in that study, what surprised you, um, and what you're seeing. I mean, you see young people every day and you see their hair, and what are you seeing and what are you hearing? I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so the study actually was a study that employed or used college age subjects or respondents. And so it was college students. And what we did was we looked at colorism and hair texture, the intersectionality of colorism and hair texture. And we morphed these different candidates to where we made them light complexion with straight or twist out hairstyles. So Afrocentric and Eurocentric hairstyles. And then we had a dark complexion candidate with either textured hair, twist outs, or straight hair. So we had one dark, one light, straight twist outs. And we wanted to see whether or not the respondents would choose one or the other and have a bias, rather, whether or not there was a bias as relates to leadership skills, policy
Dr.
issues.
Orey, I'm gonna interrupt you because we have an inclusive audience, and I always like to explain things. What is colorism?
Okay.
And what is a twist out?
All right. Yes. So,
because sometimes when we get in the room with family, we'd be like,
so colorism is based on complexions and biases that exist related to complexion. So light complexion, dark complexion African Americans, lighter complexion African Americans, and then the twist out. I can't show you with my hair, but it's I see my wife when she twists her hair, and Kimberly, you're gonna have to help me on this one. She twists it, and then it boom. The next day, it magic. So yeah, but what we looked at whether or not there was a bias, and what we found was, interestingly, and I say interestingly because this is runs counter to the Black Doll study, where with Kenny Manning and his and Dr. Manning and his wife, they found that Black kids preferred the white doll when they were determining which doll one wanted to, which doll they preferred. They preferred the white doll. And so there's always been this sort of framework, theoretical framework, that you have this internalized racism, if you will, or these intra-racial resentful attitudes, or whatever the case may be, biases, that Blacks would prefer lighter complexion individuals relative to dark complexion individuals. So in this particular case, we found that out of all of the pictures, they chose the dark complexion, whether it was straight or twist outs, as the more attractive individual. So remember now, these are morphed individuals, so the facial features are the same. The only thing we control for is the complexion and the hairstyle. So they actually chose the darker complexion candidate as being more attractive. And so that runs counter to the existing framework that lighter complexion was deemed to be more aesthetically pleasing, if you will, the Eurocentric model. And we also found that dark candidates, I think, with twist outs were more likely to support HBCUs. So we were looking at racial issues to see, and then the last one was Black nationalist views, individuals who believed that you should buy at only Black stores, individuals who believe that you should join Black organizations.
So let me.
Go ahead.
So yeah. So let me. Okay. So we've got the pictures of the morphed features, and some are light, some are dark, some have straight hair, some have twist outs, natural hair, and the participants said the more attractive people are the dark skinned people. So that's number one, right?
Right.
And then explain to me again about the support of HBCUs and the Black nationalism.
Yeah.
How was that
Yeah.
manifested in the study?
Right. So thank you for interjecting. So they took a survey. They were given a pamphlet, and it had you either got a dark woman with twist outs, that's the one you got, or the next person would have got the dark woman with straight hair, or the next person would have gotten the light woman with twist outs, so on and so forth. So each individual would receive a different individual subject or stimulus. And then they would indicate whether or not this individual was hardworking on a scale of 1 to 7, lazy being 1, 7 being hardworking. You would, give it a number between 1 and 7. And then it would ask questions like, do you think this individual would support HBCUs? And then you would give it a score. And then it would ask questions like, do you think this individual would support buying from all Black stores? Well, that was operationalized, or that was measuring Black nationalism, and we found that people believe that the darker complexion woman would be more of a Black nationalist, and the light complexion woman would not be subscribing to Black nationalist views. Which is, it's sort of intuitive.
That's very interesting because, and I've just recently been thinking a lot about, colorism and how it has changed throughout history in the Black community, right? Because like you said, back then, we would think that if you're, light is right, and, a lot of I know my ancestors and my great grandparents grew up with, being made fun of or being considered, not as pretty because they were dark skinned, and, there's this divide. And like now it just seems we kind of just flipped. Like now, dark skin is in, and the more dark you are, the more Afrocentric you are. And as a dark skinned woman, I have experienced that just even different from how I wear my hair. When I wear my afro, everybody assumes that I'm a Black nationalist, that I'm down, that I'm, just because of my hair, and they talk to me different, and they actually, their questioning is different. And so it's just interesting. I just wanted to ask your opinion on why you think what has really shifted in our community to where we kind of went to this extreme where now light skin is not good and dark skin is better.
Well, I think it's socialization. I think that, over time, individuals have begun to embrace, who they are and love who they are. And that may have started as a fad, but I think that it also has some substance related to people loving who they are, loving the skin they're in, loving their hair. And so I think that that's just evolved over time. And, that I think that's, it has evolved to that point.
Can you explain to us what you mean by intersectionality in Black women?
Yeah, so intersectionality is the notion that, and I'll give you an example. Intersectionality is this notion that Black women are discriminated against, one, as Blacks by women, white women, and then they're discriminated against as women by Black men. And so I remember when Alice Clark said that Alice Clark, representative, first Black woman to be elected as a legislator in the state legislature in Mississippi. She said that she had been in the House of Representatives for a while, and then a white woman was elected to office, and they came to the white woman and gave her a key and said, "Here's your key to the restroom." And Alice Clark said, she looked and said, "What key?" She had been going upstairs to use the restroom all those years, and there was a key right there on the floor. And so that was a case where I think, I thought that was a really good anecdote as to, how Black women are discriminated against as women and as Blacks. But so the research that I've done in that area looks at Mississippi state legislatures. I look at whether or not Black women would be more likely to introduce progressive bills when compared to their other colleagues. So that includes Black men, white women, and white men. And I found that Black women are more likely to introduce progressive legislative bills when compared to these other groups.
Our friend Casey Lehman won the MacArthur Genius Grant this week. And one of the things we talked about when he was on the show was I was talking about misogyny in the Black church. And I always say, if you just left, you could shut down misogyny and some other things. Think about if Black women left the Mississippi legislature, what would happen? Or any legislative body. You think, what would happen? Like if you just left, if Black women left church for a week.
That's right.
Just a week. There would be such a turnaround because people it wouldn't operate.
Right.
One of the things I've noticed, and this is just a comment, and you can comment on it. Studies have shown, and I think these studies are pretty old at this point, that the people who are seen as least attractive by other races are Black women and Asian men. But more recently, when you saw biracial couples, it would be a Black man and a white woman, or a white man and an Asian woman, or a Black man and an Asian woman. But rarely were those two groups, Black women and Asian men, really participating in cross-racial dating like they are now. Like I scroll through prom pictures every prom season or homecoming season, and I'm just, as a middle-aged Black woman from Mississippi, I'm a little stunned. I'm like, wow, we are really, because I think when you see people as a person you find attractive, a person you're willing to date, I really do think that offers some hope, as opposed to seeing that person as the other. And also, I think it creates, what I think we've seen in a lot of ways, because fairer skin, straighter hair was seen as more attractive. There was also fetishizing of other races that we have done.
Mm-hmm.
If you date a Black woman, a white woman, an Asian woman, you just like ladies, or you like men, or whatever you like, smart people or people who are funny. But there is some fetishizing that can be done of other races. And that's just another layer of the other. Either you're the other or they're the other.
Yeah. No, I mean, so just to build on that, not to address that directly. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say something totally different.
Oh, well, you go ahead. I was going to add on to that.
You just made me think, though. So the next study is actually going to look at Black men. So look at colorism in Black men hair texture. And so this is something that the students and I we've gotten images. We just need to get to launch the experiment. But that's just another study we're going to look at. And these are the subjects that we use in the study are all Black. So I'm interested in intra-racial attitudes. So how did I get there? I used to do research on white racism. When I was at the University of New Orleans, I was doing research on this new term called racial resentment. So old-fashioned racism was this, belief that Blacks are biologically inferior to whites. And, you can take a survey, you can answer the questions, and you determine whether or not an individual has these racist beliefs. Well, people got smart and they began to give you these social desirable responses. And so now you don't have good measures. Well, there was a new body of literature that evolved where they looked at what we call the new racism, which is racial resentment. And it's this notion that Blacks do not subscribe to, for example, the Protestant work ethic of hard work. And it's rooted in individualism. And so when we looked at this new racism or this new what we call resentment, because like one of the questions was the Jews, the Irish, the Italians were able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Blacks should do the same. It wasn't worded exactly like that, but it was basically that blacks should do the same or be held to the same standards. And then there was a question that read generations of that slavery had no impact on the current conditions of blacks. Well, that gets at like rejecting structural barriers. And it also gets at blaming individuals. And so it discounts the fact that none of those other groups were enslaved. And so they were not, they gave them equal value, if you will. So anyway, let's see how I can explain this. This is a survey. So we're doing these analyses. I'll just leave it at analyses. We do these analyses where we examine whether or not, for example, people who have high levels of resentment are more likely to support a racially conservative candidate. In New Orleans at the time, Louisiana, there was a guy by the name of Mike Foster. Well, I wanted to see if we, I'm looking at whites, and there was a black candidate running, Cleo Fields, and we wanted to see whether or not people believe that Mike Foster, the white racial conservative, was perceived to be more hardworking compared to Cleo Fields. Well, I wanted to see now, how would black people respond to these questions, and what does that relationship look like for them? And what we found was that black people who had resentful attitudes toward other black people were more likely to believe that Mike Foster was more hardworking when compared to Cleo Fields. And so that's how I started getting into this this research on intra-racial attitudes. And that led me down this road of internalized racism, implicit biases that blacks harbor toward one another, so on and so forth. I hope I made a point somewhere in there.
You did. I mean, I think focusing on interracial, I think that's a big part of, number one, understanding who we are and then how to go forward. We have to kind of have these honest conversations and kind of figure out where we are in our thinking today as a people. So I think that your research is very important.
And so in my thinking, one way to combat this internalized racism. So you internalize these negative stereotypes that exist in the world. You see it on TV every day. I don't want to, well, we watch Atlanta Housewives or something, and you see black women behaving a certain way, and you internalize that. So you internalize all this negative imagery and substantive information, and then you project it back onto black people. And so you have these internalized racial beliefs that lead to a particular behavior. And the way that I think that it can be resolved or ameliorated is by education. Having textbooks that have positive imagery and substantive positive information related to black folk, that begins to increase blacks' racial identity, assuming that the information, can enhance their racial identity. And increasing racial identity then can constrain that quote unquote self-hatred. So if you can provide material that increases racial identity, then you can constrain that self-hatred. And so that's what I'm interested in now.
Todd, we are going to get to your question. I hope you're still watching. But I think Azia, you wanted, well, I can ask you, and then Azia, you can follow up. So one of the things we were talking about is you are working on revising a textbook that was my textbook in middle school, and apparently it was controversial. I had no idea.
Yes.
So tell us about that book, how it came to land in Mississippi classrooms, how it was different from other books at the time, and what your plans are for the revision.
Yeah, so Jim Loewen, fabulous guy. unbelievable guy. He worked at Tougaloo in the early 1970s. He was a professor at Tougaloo. He recently passed last year, unfortunately, but he wrote a book that sold almost 2 million copies. It sold 1.8 million copies. The book is Lies My Teacher Told Me. And so Jim Loewen was here when he was at Tougaloo. He decided that he would write a book on Mississippi history because when he was teaching Reconstruction, the students had the belief that when Black people took office after slavery and they were put in high positions like lieutenant governors and legislators, then the United States went to shambles. And so when he heard some of the students making those comments, he said, where are they getting this from? And then he looked at the Mississippi history book that they were using and he found the answer. So he decided that he would get with some of his students, one of his colleagues at Millsaps, and they would actually write this Mississippi history book. The book was controversial, but it was controversial simply because it included images like lynchings. It included an accurate discussion of Reconstruction. And so the textbook commission rejected the book, and Jim Loewen filed a lawsuit, Loewen versus Turnipseed, in federal court, and he won. He won, and so the state had to give school districts the option of choosing that textbook. And so there were school districts, Kimberly just said that they used it, and those school districts did adopt it. Some school districts did adopt it, some didn't. But it's a very, very progressive book. Some of the things that are included in there, I was just, I couldn't believe it. I mean, some of the what was it? I can't think of it, but it was based on the shucks. This is gonna bother me, but anyway, he included a lot with the Reconstruction chapter, but then he also included a lot of related to women. Included the first white woman who was state legislator. That was not in the Mississippi history book at the time. He included, discussions of Fannie Lou Hamer, Annie Devine. I mean, he was really detailed in a very, very short, in a book that was that size. It was amazing how much he could pack in that book. And so before he passed away, he called and he said, "Look, I want to revisit this textbook and I want to republish it." And so what I'm doing now is going through, and man, his fate was just, on my side. He had a textbook that he had actually written edits in. So I actually have the book where, he did a lot of editing. So that helped me out a lot. But I'm going to add 2 additional chapters. One is a political chapter and bringing it up to speed in terms of where we are now relative to where that one stopped. It stopped in 1980. So we go from 1980 to 2020. And then I have a couple of edits that need to be made. And one edit that he made when he was discussing musicians, he actually had Nate Dogg on there as one of the musicians that needed to be included. And I was, this is, Jim Loewen's a 78-year-old white man. And I'm like, I was really impressed when I went through and saw some of those edits. But that was Jim though. But yeah, we're hoping to have that done by December. And once it gets to the publisher, then it's out of our control. But at least I'll have my end done.
Okay, I have 1 quick question. So we asked Todd a question. Todd, I'm so sorry, but I definitely want to ask about what you're doing, the work you're doing on racial trauma right now, real quick, and then we can ask, because Todd's question it's gonna take us a whole nother way. So I want to save that. It's a very good question.
Yeah. So the trauma work, I'm a political psychologist, and we get at the the root of we get politics, the root of politics in the brain, literally sometimes. So we actually have a lab where I have these electrodes. I connect you to these electrodes to see how much you sweat, to see how much your heart rate increases, to see, whether or not your eyebrows move, and it's not something that you can control. So I don't want to go here, but I'll say it, the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. We look at, for example, when someone would look at the state flag, did it actually increase their sympathetic nervous response? I'll just say it like that. And what we found was, and this is something we were going to use if the flag would have hung around, that Blacks who see the flag actually have an emotional response to it, and that emotional response is measured using physiological equipment. So you can measure how much someone sweats, and how much they sweat then actually gets at what we're suggesting. It gets at that trauma, because you go into a danger zone when you sweat too much. And so we measured trauma, or we operationalized trauma by using this physiological response measure. But we also look at trauma. For example, we look at mental distress related to COVID. And the previous research just said, okay, people who watch a lot of news stories related to COVID are more likely to worry and have fear related to COVID. That's the trauma, the worry and the fear. Well, we said, look, you can't talk about trauma and not talk about police killings. And so we ran an analysis. We launched a survey, and we ran an analysis. We found that Blacks who are nervous when they see the police are also more likely to have mental distress related to COVID. So when they think about COVID, they're more likely to be fearful. And this is a result of also the trauma related to being stopped by the police. And so that's cumulative trauma. So they don't only have to worry about COVID, they have to worry about police shootings. And these are things that they're consuming. This is information that they're consuming. So it's not like they can, just go get away. So that's some of the work we're working on now. And we're also looking at emotions related to political participation and how trauma might impact political participation as well.
Are y'all considering any epigenetics as far as racial trauma, historical racial trauma, and compounding it with today's racial trauma?
Yeah, so intergenerational trauma. I've read studies. That have gotten at that, but now you've opened up. So we only have a few minutes, but I got to say this real quick. So we also were doing work on genetics and politics. So really quick, we look at twin data. I didn't realize they were using twin data to study genetics and politics once. And I was really looking at my colleagues in Nebraska with, really side eye, because I'm thinking about eugenics when I'm thinking genetics and, politics. But when I found out, they were looking at, political behavior, whether or not genetics can lead to participation. And what they were using was twin data. You have identical twins, they answer the survey. They answer the survey, and we see whether or not there's a correlation between whether or not they voted and their twin voted. And then you have non-identical twins, which is just brothers and sisters. And so there's a way that you can actually examine, using survey data, whether or not identical twins are voting and non-identical twins are not voting. I shouldn't have gone there, but I'll send you the paper.
Dr. Orey, you can post under. These will be on Facebook and YouTube, and you can come back and just post away. But we have one question. I'm going to ask it. Todd has been so patient. He has been commenting. You got 3 minutes, Dr. Orey. And he has redistricting impacted the water issue in Jackson? I don't know. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, so I mean, that would have to be an issue at the state level, and the state. I mean, they did, I guess, support at one time, assisting the city. The time when the governor vetoed and then came back around. But no, I don't think there's a relationship there. The city council is not an issue of redistricting, unless I'm not understanding the question. If he can do a follow up, maybe.
Yeah, I don't. I think you maybe answered it. But again, this will be on Facebook. Todd answered the question on Facebook, so if he wants to ask another question, we can go under it and maybe get some clarification. But our producer is yelling at us, and she's not a yeller, so.
Right.
Okay, so want to let everyone know about our member event with Governor Ronnie Musgrove on Tuesday, the 18th. He's going to talk about all manner of stuff, but one of the things he's talking about is medical marijuana, because he has a part of his business is medical. He's starting his medical marijuana evaluation, and we're going to talk with him about how he's changed on this subject. So really excited to sit down with him. That's for MFP VIP club members, and you can join for just $10 a month or $100 a year. And you can go back and watch or listen to all of our previous events, which include events with New York Times bestselling author Angie Thomas, Oscar-nominated Anjanou Ellis, Lincoln Project consultant Stuart Stevens. We got so many. It's really a value, and I hope to see you there. I think that's it. We have a surprise guest next week, so we'll be letting you guys know about that in a couple days. It was amazing, as always. We need an hour and a half when we have Dr. We need an hour and a half. I'm like Arika, who said, I always learn so much. I thought I knew stuff, and then you're like, I didn't know that. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. And if you're watching the replay, drop a comment. We'll see you next week.
Bye.